Some confessions can't be spoken. They have to be tasted. There is a soup that cannot lie. It only works for a true heart, and neither of them meant to make it. We begin our story now. The ministry cafeteria at 1:30 had the particular emptiness of a place that had recently been full. Chairs sat askew where people had abandoned them. A fork lay tines up on the floor near the queue, glinting under the enchanted ceiling that today had decided to mimic a flat, pewter sky, the kind of light that made everything look slightly underwater. Hermione Granger stood at the threshold of it all and patted the side of her bag for the third time, as though the gesture might conjure what wasn't there. It wasn't there. The neat little container of leftover risotto she had assembled at 6 that morning, half asleep, certain of her own competence, was sitting in her flat on the kitchen counter, exactly where she had set it down to find her left shoe. She let out a breath through her nose. The hunger was a low, insistent hum beneath her ribs, the kind that made the parchment on her desk seem unbearable and her colleagues' voices abrasive. She had eaten nothing since a slice of toast she didn't remember tasting. The afternoon held a meeting she could not afford to enter, with her thoughts gone thin and irritable. Then she remembered the chocolate. A bar of dark chocolate, the good Honeydukes kind, forgotten in the bottom of her locker since some long-ago crisis. It had migrated under a spare jumper and a tangle of quills, but it would be there. Chocolate did not walk off on its own. She turned on her heel and left her things. Her bag slumped against the chair, her cardigan draped over its back, the small territory she had claimed at a table near the window, and went to retrieve it. The corridor to the lockers smelled of damp wool and the faint ozone tang that lingered wherever a great many people, apparated and disapparated in a single building, that sharp mineral bite at the back of the throat. Her heels struck the stone in a hollow, doubled rhythm. The second beat the echo of the first. She found the locker, wrestled it open, dug past the jumper, and there it was. The chocolate, gone slightly pale with age, but whole. A small, ridiculous triumph. She closed her fist around it and felt, absurdly, that the day had been partly redeemed. When she came back, there was a bowl of soup where her bag had been. She stopped 2 paces from the table. The bowl was plain white, the sort the cafeteria stacked by the 100. But it had not been there when she left, and it was steaming, and it sat squarely in the center of her place, as though it had been set there for her and no one else. Her bag had been moved, nudged considerately onto the seat beside her own. Her cardigan was undisturbed. No note, no name, no person anywhere in the long room to have done it. The nearest soul was a wizard from magical transport 3 tables away, hunched over a newspaper, and he had the oblivious stillness of someone who had not looked up in 20 minutes. Hermione's first instinct, honed by years of vigilance, was suspicion. One did not eat unattended food in a building full of people who knew curses. There were protocols. There were, in fact, signs. All consumables must be obtained through approved channels, laminated and ignored on every wall. She stood over the bowl with her arms folded and regarded it the way she might regard a witness whose story didn't hold. But then the smell reached her properly. It came up on the steam and unfolded. There was no other word for it. It unfolded like something opening a door she hadn't known was in the room. Beneath the obvious warmth of broth, there was time, and something deeper, a slow-roasted sweetness of onions cooked down past patience into gold. And under that, a note she couldn't name, faintly herbal, faintly resinous, that made her think, without knowing why, of a fire in winter and a hand at the small of her back. Her mouth watered so suddenly and so completely that she had to swallow. Her stomach turned over in something close to grief. "This is absurd," she told herself. "You are a grown woman and a senior official, and you are about to be undone by a bowl of unsolicited soup." She looked around again. The transport wizard turned a page. The pewter ceiling held its flat light. The room was hers, and the soup's and no one else's. There was a spoon beside the bowl. That detail snagged at her, the deliberateness of it. The spoon laid parallel to the rim with a tidiness that felt less like cafeteria carelessness and more like care. And she found that her hand had already closed around it before she had finished deciding. Just to identify the ingredients, she thought, which was the lie of a woman who fully intended to eat the whole thing. The first spoonful undid every argument she had marshalled against it. It was warmth before it was flavour. Warmth that went down her throat and seemed to keep going, spreading outward beneath her sternum, into her shoulders, down her arms to her cold fingertips, as though the soup were not merely hot, but lit from within. The taste arrived a half-second behind, rich and clean and layered, savoury, giving way to that nameless herbal hum, with a finish so gentle it felt less like eating than like being told a kind thing in a language older than words. She had not realised how tightly she'd been holding her own face until it loosened. Her shoulders, which lived somewhere up near her ears most days, came down. The hum of hunger went quiet, and into the quiet came something she had no name for and didn't try to find one for. A settling, a sense of the day rearranging itself into something she could carry. She ate slowly. She ate every drop. When the spoon scraped the bottom of the bowl, she sat for a moment longer with her hands curved around the warm white ceramic, reluctant to let it cool, and a small, foolish smile she would have died before admitting to had arranged itself on her mouth. The meeting at 2 was about the standardization of magical creature welfare reporting across departments, a subject over which she had, in the past, ground her teeth to powder. Today, she walked into it light. When old Pemberton from Beings repeated his tired objection for the 4th time, she did not feel the familiar serration of irritation behind her eyes. She heard him out, found the single grain of sense in what he said, and answered him so reasonably that he sat back blinking, robbed of the fight he'd come for. Twice during the meeting, a colleague glanced at her with mild surprise, as though some sound they were braced for had not come. And then there was Draco Malfoy. He came into the late afternoon briefing the way he always did, already seated when she arrived somehow, a sheaf of parchment squared precisely before him, the silver of his signet ring catching the candlelight when he turned a page. They had been assigned 3 weeks prior and over Hermione's strenuous internal objections to the same cross-departmental initiative, a legislative review of post-war property restitution, a thicket of old claims and older grudges that required, the powers that be had decided, both her command of legal principle and his command of the families whose vaults and manors and inherited curses made up the bulk of the disputed estate. She had spent those 3 weeks in a state of controlled friction. He was clipped. He was precise. He answered her directly and never warmly. Every exchange between them carried a low static charge, the sort that lifts the fine hairs on the forearm, and she had grown used to leaving each meeting with her jaw set. Today, he made some remark. She would not, afterward, be able to reconstruct exactly what it was. Something dry about a clerk's filing error that on another afternoon would have struck her as supercilious, as typical. And she found, to her own astonishment, that she laughed. It was a short laugh, and a real one, and it surprised them both. Malfoy's eyes came up from his parchment. For a fraction of a second, something crossed his face that she had no category for. A flicker, quickly suppressed, that was not his usual cool appraisal, and not contempt, and not the careful blankness he wore like a second set of robes. He looked at her as though she had spoken a word in a language he hadn't heard in a long time, and had given up expecting to hear again. Then his expression smoothed itself, and he looked back down at his work, and the meeting went on. But the silver ring tapped once, twice against the table edge, a small betraying rhythm, before his hand went still. She did not think anything of it. She was full and warm and unaccountably content, and she chalked the laugh up to that, to the soup, to the rare luxury of a day that had stopped fighting her. On the lift down to the atrium, she caught her own reflection in the brass and saw the residue of that ridiculous smile still loitering at the corner of her mouth. And she let it stay. It was only on the walk home, with the London evening coming down soft and grey and the street lamps blooming one by one into being, that the strangeness of the thing reasserted itself. Someone had left her soup. Someone had moved her bag with care, had laid a spoon parallel to the rim, had set the bowl in the exact centre of her place, and then vanished before she returned, wanting no credit, no thanks, no acknowledgement at all. Someone had known she would be hungry. Someone had known she would be alone in that emptied room at 1:30. She stopped on the pavement. A fine rain had begun, the kind too light to see, but felt as a cool mist against the face, and it beaded in her hair and along the wool of her sleeve. She thought of the spoon, laid so neatly. She thought, without wanting to, of silver tapping twice against a table edge, and then going still. And she stood there in the gathering dark with her key half drawn from her pocket, and the rain settling on her shoulders, certain of nothing except that the question had teeth, and that she was going to have to find out whose hands had made it. She slept badly, which she resented, because there was no reason for it. The flat was warm. The rain that had followed her home tapered off before midnight, and left behind only the wet pavement smell that crept in around the window frame, that particular London perfume of stone and cold and exhaust gone clean. She lay in the dark and listened to the radiator tick, and found that her mind, ordinarily so biddable, so easily marched into line and set to useful work, kept wandering back to a white bowl and the considerate displacement of her bag. She did not like puzzles she could not solve before falling asleep. It was a small vanity, but a deep one. By 2 a.m, she had constructed and demolished 6 explanations. a kindness from a junior colleague hoping to be remembered at promotion time, some new pilot scheme from the cafeteria staff, a free sample meant to lure overworked civil servants away from their desks, a simple mistake, a bowl set down by a distracted server who had then forgotten it entirely. Each theory collapsed under the same weight. None of them accounted for the spoon. The spoon had been placed. There was intention in the spoon, and intention was the one ingredient she could not explain away. She rose, unrested and irritable, and arrived at the ministry with the specific brittleness of a woman who has decided to pretend she slept fine. The morning was a wall of work. Restitution claims came in stacks bound with the ministry's grey ribbon, and each one was a small tragedy with a number on it. A family turned out of a cottage during the war, a vault sealed by a curse no one living knew how to lift, a manor whose deed had passed through 4 hands by forgery and threat, and was now claimed by all 4. She worked through them with her quill scratching its dry path across the parchment, the tooth of the old paper catching at the nib, and she did not think about soup, except for the several dozen times she did. By the time Verity Abbott appeared at her office door, jangling with the news that it was past 1, and that Hermione had once again, predictably, forgotten to feed herself, she had nearly convinced herself the whole episode of the previous afternoon had been a fever dream of low blood sugar. "You look dreadful," Verity announced, with the cheerful brutality of a woman who had occupied the desk across from Hermione's for 6 years and had earned the right. Verity Abbott was 60, if she was a day, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with a memory like a steel trap and a tongue to match, and she had survived 4 ministers and 1 war with her opinions intact. "Come and eat before you fall over, and I have to fill out the paperwork." The cafeteria at this hour was full. The lunchtime crush, the long queues, the clatter and steam and roar of 200 conversations. The enchanted ceiling had cheered up since yesterday and showed a high blue sky scudded with fast white cloud. Hermione joined the queue with Verity at her elbow, keeping up a running commentary on the failings of the Wizengamot's newest appointee, and she had her tray half-loaded with the safe and unremarkable choices of a woman who has been burned by mystery before. A roll, a wedge of cheese, an apple, when the smell reached her. It came across the whole crowded room and found her the way a hand finds a familiar shape in the dark. She went still with the apple halfway to her tray. There was no mistaking it. The same opening warmth, the same slow gold sweetness of onions cooked past patience, the same time and that same nameless resinous undernote that pulled at something behind her sternum and made her think, against all sense, of firelight and a steadying hand. Her body remembered before her mind caught up. The warmth of yesterday ghosted through her shoulders, and her grip on the apple loosened. Beside her, Verity had also gone still. The older woman lifted her chin and breathed in, slowly, and her expression, which a moment before had been all dry amusement, rearranged itself into something Hermione had never seen on her before, something almost stricken, something that was, beneath its surprise, soft. "Well," said Verity very quietly, "I'll be damned." "What is it?" Hermione's voice came out sharper than she meant. "Verity, you know that smell." "I know that smell," Verity agreed, still breathing it in, her eyes gone unfocused with a distance that wasn't the cafeteria at all. I haven't smelled that in Merlin 20 years. More. She turned to Hermione, and there was a strange, searching attention in her face. Has someone learned to make the Malfoy soup? The name dropped into the noise of the room and landed in Hermione's chest like a stone into still water. The what? Verity steered her, tray and all, out of the queue and to a small table at the room's quieter edge, with the brisk authority of a woman delivering important news and unwilling to shout it. She sat and patted the seat across from her and waited until Hermione had sat too before she spoke, and when she did, her voice had dropped into the register people use for things that are partly secret and partly sacred. There's a soup, Verity said, that's been made in the Malfoy family for, generations. Longer than anyone can properly say. It isn't in any cookbook. You won't find it in magical gastronomy or any of the standard texts, because it isn't strictly a recipe in the way those books mean. It's, She searched for the word, her ringed fingers turning in the air. A working. A piece of old domestic magic, the kind that used to be common in the great houses before everyone got too modern and proud to bother with it. Hearth magic. The sort women made and men forgot to thank them for. Hermione, who built her whole self on the foundation of "I have read about this," felt the unfamiliar vertigo of having read about nothing of the kind. I've never heard of it. You wouldn't have, Verity said, not unkindly. It was never written down because it can't be. The ingredients are ordinary enough. I couldn't tell you precisely what they are, but I've heard they're nothing you couldn't buy at any greengrocer. That's the point. That's what makes it remarkable. The magic isn't in the components. She leaned in, and the steam of the soup that someone was carrying past wreathed between them and made her eyes go bright. The magic is in the making. You can have every ingredient measured to the grain, every step performed exactly, and it'll come out as a perfectly nice, perfectly ordinary soup. Pleasant, forgettable. Unless... She paused. Unless the person making it makes it with a true heart, sincere intention. Real goodwill toward whoever's going to eat it. Then... And here she gestured at the room, at the smell of it hanging in the warm air. Then it does what you tasted. If you've tasted it. Have you tasted it? Hermione's mouth had gone dry. Yesterday, she heard herself say, someone left a bowl at my place. I didn't know who. I ate it. Verity sat back and looked at her with a long, slow speculation that Hermione did not like at all. And how did you feel afterward? She thought of the meeting. She thought of Pemberton, robbed of his fight. She thought of laughing, really laughing, at something Draco Malfoy had said, and of the warmth that had carried her all the way home through the rain. Good, she admitted. The word cost her something. I felt good, lighter. I was in a good mood for the rest of the day, which is... She stopped. Which is not like me, she did not say. That's it, Verity said softly. That's it, exactly. That's what it does. It doesn't bewitch you, mind. It's not a love potion. Nothing so crude. No compulsion in it. It just opens a window. Lets a little light into wherever you've been keeping the cold. Her gaze had gone distant again. Narcissa Malfoy used to make it. Did you know that? Lovely woman, underneath all that ice. And there was a great deal of ice. I won't pretend otherwise. But she made that soup. She'd bring it to the ministry whenever Lucius had some great fraught business on, some hearing, some negotiation he was dreading, and she'd have it sent round to everyone involved, friend and adversary alike, which was the strange thing about it. Before the war this was, the early days. You'd be sat across a table from the man, fully intending to ruin his afternoon, and a bowl of his wife's soup would arrive, and somehow, by the end of it, nobody had quite the appetite for cruelty they'd come in with. Verity smiled, a private, rueful thing. She knew exactly what she was doing. It was the cleverest disarmament I ever saw, and it looked for all the world like nothing but kindness. Perhaps it was both. Hermione sat very still. Around them, the cafeteria roared and clattered, oblivious. Somewhere, a tray crashed, and a ragged cheer went up. The blue ceiling held its fast white clouds, and in the middle of all that ordinary din, she felt the floor of her certainty shift beneath her, the way it had not shifted in a long time. "But they're gone," she said slowly, thinking aloud, working it the way she worked a knotted clause in a statute. The Malfoys, the elder ones, Narcissa and Lucius, they left the city years ago. They live somewhere in the country now, don't they? Retired, quiet, out of all of it. They don't come to the ministry. They haven't for... She frowned. So, if she's the one who makes it, and she's not here... "She isn't here," Verity confirmed. "Hasn't set foot in this building since before the trials. No, whoever made this." She nodded toward the queue, where a server was ladling out bowl after steaming bowl of it, where half the room had now caught the smell and turned their heads toward it like plants toward sun. "Whoever made this is here, in this building, today." And then Verity, who missed nothing, who had survived 4 ministers precisely because she missed nothing, watched Hermione's face with great care and said, in a tone of perfect innocence that fooled neither of them, "Now, who do we know in this building, I wonder, who might have learned a Malfoy family secret? Who's been working very closely with our department lately, on something rather important, something fraught?" She let it hang. Something his mother might once have made soup for. Hermione did not answer. She could not, because the answer had assembled itself in her mind all at once and complete, the way the solution to a problem she'd been circling for hours sometimes did. The spoon laid parallel to the rim, the bag moved with care, the silver ring tapping twice against the table edge and going still, the flicker of something on his face when she laughed that she had not had a category for, and now, terribly, did. He had made it. He had stood in some kitchen and made his mother's soup with a true heart and a sincere intention, and brought it here and left it at her place, and told no one, wanted no thanks, vanished before she returned. And the recipe could not be faked. That was the entire point of it, the whole architecture of the magic. A perfect bowl was not evidence of skill. A perfect bowl was evidence of feeling. He could not have made it work unless he had meant it toward her, specifically for her to eat. And the soup had worked so completely that she had laughed at his dry little joke and walked home warm through the rain. The implications opened beneath her one after another, each one wider than the last, and she found she could not look directly at the largest of them. Her hands, she realized, had begun to rearrange the items on her tray with a sudden and pointless precision. The rolls squared against the cheese, The apple turned so its stem pointed true north, straightening, ordering, a frantic small busyness to give her fingers something to do that was not trembling. "Hermione," said Verity, watching all of this with open and delighted interest. "You've gone a very interesting colour." "I have to go," Hermione said, standing so abruptly that her chair scraped a long protesting note across the stone. The roll rolled off the tray and onto the floor, and she left it there. There's a thing, a document. I have to find Malfoy." "Of course you do," Verity said serenely, and lifted her teacup in something that was almost a toast. Hermione was already moving, already weaving through the lunchtime crowd toward the doors, her heart going hard and quick against her ribs, the smell of the soup following her all the way out. Warmth and time, and that nameless resin-bright note that she now understood, with a clarity that frightened her, had been made for no one in that room but her. And she did not slow, and she did not look back, and she had no idea on earth what she was going to say to him when she found him. She found him exactly where logic said he would be, which somehow made it worse. There was no relief in the prediction holding true, only the dread of the thing arriving on schedule. The cross-departmental initiative had been allotted a working room on the 4th level, a long, narrow chamber that had once been a records overflow and still smelled faintly of it, of old leather and the dry mineral dust of paper left too long in the dark. It had a single tall window that looked out on nothing. The ministry's windows looked out on whatever the atrium's weather charm felt like showing, and today it showed the same high blue and fast cloud as the ceiling downstairs, which felt to Hermione like being watched by something that had also been watching her at lunch. A long table ran the length of the room, buried under the grey-ribboned stacks of the restitution claims, and at the far end of it, alone, with his sleeves turned back and a quill in his hand, and the afternoon light laying a pale stripe across the parchment before him, sat Draco Malfoy. He did not look up when she came in. He had a way of not looking up that managed to acknowledge her arrival and dismiss it in the same instant. The slight stillness that came over him, the half-second pause in the quill's movement before it resumed. The silver signet ring sat heavy on his finger, and as she watched it, caught the light and threw a small cold gleam across the ceiling. She shut the door behind her. The latch fell with a sound louder than she intended in the paper-muffled quiet. "You made the soup," she said. The quill stopped. For a long moment he did not move at all, and the room held its breath with him, the dust motes turning slow in the bar of window light, the stacked claims with their grey ribbons, the faint tick of the radiator. Then he set the quill down, carefully, parallel to the edge of the parchment, and she thought, with a lurch, he lays everything parallel. That's his hand. That was always his hand on the spoon, and he raised his eyes to her at last. His face gave her nothing. It was the face he wore in every meeting, the careful and expensive blankness, the cool grey appraisal that had infuriated her for 3 weeks. But she had learned, in 3 weeks, to watch his hands instead, and his hands betrayed him. The fingers of his right hand had curled inward against his palm, slowly, until the knuckles stood up white and sharp beneath the skin. "I don't know what you mean," he said. "Yes, you do." She came further into the room, around the foot of the table, and she was aware that her own voice had gone low, and even in the way it did when she was certain of her ground. The courtroom register, the register that had unmade better liars than him. Yesterday, in the cafeteria, someone left a bowl of soup at my place when I'd gone to my locker. No note, no name. My bag moved aside so it wouldn't be in the way. The spoon laid parallel to the rim. She watched the white knuckles. You lay everything parallel, your quill, just now. You've done it every meeting for 3 weeks, and I never thought anything of it until I saw the spoon. Something moved at the corner of his jaw, a muscle tightening and releasing. It was the Malfoy soup, she went on, and saw the name land, saw the small flinch he could not entirely suppress, a tightening around the eyes. Your mother's recipe, the hearth working. I had it described to me not 20 minutes ago by someone who remembers your mother bringing it to this very building before the war to soften everyone up before your father's hearings. So, don't tell me you don't know what I mean, Malfoy, because we both know that soup cannot be made by anyone who doesn't mean it. That's the whole point of it. It doesn't work unless the person making it is sincere. Her heart was going hard, but her voice held. It worked. So you meant it. You meant it for me. I want to know why. The silence that followed had a texture to it, a pressure, like the held charge of the air before a storm finally breaks. He looked at her, and she made herself look back, and she would not be the one to glance away first. She had decided that in the corridor, and she held to it now. The bar of window light crept a fraction along the table. Somewhere far below, the ministry went about its enormous ordinary business, indifferent. When he spoke, his voice was flat and clipped and entirely controlled, and only because she was watching his hand did she see that the white-knuckled fist had not loosened at all. "You'd forgotten your lunch," he said. "You do it about once a fortnight. You forget to eat, and then you're vicious all afternoon, and the rest of us have to manage you." A pause. "We have the Wormwood claim before the review board on Thursday. It's the most complicated file we've got, and you're the only person on this initiative who understands the precedent well enough to argue it. I couldn't have you walking into Thursday's prep half-starved and furious." He turned the quill a precise degree where it lay. "So, I left you something to eat. It's a project that affects me too, Granger. Considerably. I have interests in the outcome." His jaw worked again. I wanted to help, in my own way. That's all it was. It was, she thought, an extraordinary performance. Every word of it was probably true. The Wormwood claim was the worst file they had. She did forget to eat. He did have interests in the outcome. Half the disputed estate touched on families he'd grown up among, and his own name was not nowhere in the record. It was all true, and it was all a wall, every brick of it laid to keep her from seeing the thing it was built around, and she knew with sudden and complete certainty that he had no idea she could see straight through it, because he had never had to account for the one fact that undid the whole architecture. "The soup worked," she said quietly. "I'm aware. You ate it. I'm gratified." "No." She set her hands flat on the table and leaned toward him, and now her voice dropped further into something almost gentle, which was somehow more relentless than the courtroom edge had been. "You're not hearing me. It worked, Malfoy. The magic worked. It can't work unless the heart behind it is true. You can't fake it. You said it yourself. Your mother used it as a disarmament, but she could only ever do that because she actually, genuinely wished the people well. Even her enemies, even your father's adversaries. Verity said it was kindness that looked like strategy, and perhaps it was both. You can't make this soup as a strategy. You can't make it because you need me sharp for Thursday. You can't make it as a favor to the project. If that were all it was, if I were just a colleague you needed functional, it would have come out flat, pleasant, forgettable, a perfectly nice ordinary soup. She watched his face and his hand and the small betraying muscle at his jaw. It did not come out forgettable. It came out so that I laughed at your stupid joke about the filing error and walked home warm. So, whatever you wished when you stood in that kitchen and made it, it wasn't I need her functional for the review board. It was sincere, and it was kind, and it was for me. A breath. Wasn't it? His hand had come open against the table. She watched it happen, the white fist uncurling, the long fingers spreading flat, the signet ring clicking once against the wood. And she understood that she had reached past the wall and put her hand on whatever it was guarding, and that he knew it, and that the knowing had taken the strength out of the fist. He did not answer. He looked at his own open hand on the table as though it belonged to someone else and had betrayed him, and the careful blankness of his face had developed a fault line through it, a crack she could see widening, and for one moment she saw straight down through it to something raw and unguarded and frightened that she had never once imagined was in him. Then he closed it again, not the hand this time, but the face, and the shutters came down, and he stood, the chair pushing back, and she straightened too, and they faced each other across the foot of the table, with perhaps 3 feet of dusty air between them, and the bar of window light falling now across the space that separated them like a drawn line neither of them had agreed to. "You should go," he said. His voice was rougher than before. The control was costing him now. She could hear what it cost. "We've both got the Wormwood file to prepare, and you've made your point, whatever you imagine your point was. Take the win, Granger. You usually do. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Malfoy. Don't." The word came out low and fast, and it stopped her where she stood, because it had no cruelty in it at all. That was the thing. That was the thing she could not get past. There was no sneer in it, no scorn, nothing of the boy she'd hated. There was only something that sounded impossibly like fear. The bare, flinching fear of a man who has spent years learning to want nothing out loud, because everything he has ever wanted out loud has been used against him. Don't make me say it. You've already worked it out. You're the cleverest person in this building. You've made very sure everyone knows it. So you don't need me to say it. Let it be the soup. Let it be the project. Take whatever you found out today and put it away, and let's both pretend, for the sake of getting through Thursday, that you walked in here to ask me about precedent. They stood in the falling light and the paper smelling quiet, 3 feet apart, neither of them moving, and Hermione discovered that her certainty had brought her all this way, and then abandoned her on the doorstep of the only thing that mattered, because she had been so busy proving that he felt something that she had given not one moment's thought to the far more dangerous question of what she felt back. And now it was here, the question, standing in the room with them, raised by the rawness in his voice and the open ruin she'd glimpsed through the crack in his face. And she found she could not answer it, and she could not leave, and she could not stop looking at him. She opened her mouth. She did not yet know what she meant to say. And before a single word of it could come, the door behind her swung open on a cheerful clatter, and Verity Abbott's voice sailed in ahead of her, bright and merciless and impeccably timed, saying, "There you are, both of you. The review board's moved Wormwood up to tomorrow. Isn't that marvelous? You'll want to start straight away." And the moment shattered like dropped glass, and Hermione turned, and Draco sat back down, and neither of them looked at the other again. The review board, in its bureaucratic wisdom, had moved the Wormwood hearing up by a full day, which meant the work that should have unspooled across an unhurried week now had to be wrung out of a single evening. And so they were sentenced to each other's company until the file was ready, or the night gave out, whichever came first. Verity, having delivered her bombshell and watched its effect with the satisfaction of a woman who knew precisely what she had interrupted, did not stay. She had the sense, or the cruelty, to leave them to it. The door shut behind her, and the silence she left was a different silence than the one before, thicker, more aware of itself, charged with everything that had not been said, and now would have to go on not being said for hours, across a table, while they pretended to care about easements and entailments. They worked. There was, at least, mercy in the work. The Wormwood claim was a genuine horror, a tangle 4 generations deep. A manor in Wiltshire seized during the war by a family who'd later been disgraced, claimed now by the original line, contested by a third party holding a deed that might be forged and might be genuine, and was, either way, cursed in some fashion that had blinded 2 clerks who'd handled it without gloves. Untangling it required both of them and required them to speak, and the speaking was all of it about the file and none of it about anything else, and that was a kind of safety. Pass me the 1981 conveyance. The curse mark predates the seizure. Look, this clause cancels that one. No. Read it again. It doesn't. It's conditional. The language of law was a country they could both inhabit without risk, and they took refuge in it gratefully. And for an hour or more, the only charge in the room was the ordinary friction of 2 sharp minds disagreeing about precedent. But the afternoon bled into evening, and the evening into night, and the ministry emptied around them. She felt it happen by degrees. The corridor sounds thinning, the distant slam of lift gates growing rarer, the great building settling into the particular hush it kept after hours, when the day shift had gone home, and only the night clerks and the truly desperate remained. The window charm, which had shown blue sky and fast cloud all afternoon, dimmed to dusk, and then to a deep indigo pricked with charm stars. And at some point, a server brought round a tray of the night shift's tea and stale biscuits, and left it without a word, and they drank the tea and did not eat the biscuits, and worked on. Someone, far off, extinguished the corridor torches one bank at a time, and the line of light beneath the door went from gold to nothing, and then the only light in the room was the candle lamp on the table between them, and the faint glow of the charm stars in the false window. Candlelight changed him. She noticed it and wished she hadn't. The hard architecture of his face, the sharp cheekbone, the set jaw, the cold grey eyes, softened in the low, warm flicker into something younger and more tired than the daylight ever showed. And the white of his shirt, where his sleeves were turned back, caught the glow, and the silver ring threw its small gleam across the parchment every time his hand moved. He had stopped, hours ago, performing for her. The careful blankness took energy, she understood now, and he had run out of the energy for it somewhere around the 9th hour, and what was left when the performance dropped was simply a man, quiet, exact, deeply weary, frowning over a cursed deed in the candlelight with a smudge of ink along the side of his hand. "You're reading the same line again," she said. It came out softer than she'd meant it to. The hush of the building had got into her voice. "I'm not." "You are. You've read that conveyance clause 3 times. I've been watching you." She had not meant to admit the watching. It hung there. He set the parchment down. He did not lay it parallel this time. He let it fall slightly askew, and the small disorder of it told her more about his state than anything he could have said. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, briefly, and when he took them away, he looked at her across the candle with an exhaustion that had worn through to honesty, the way exhaustion does at 1 in the morning, when the will to maintain oneself has simply gone. "Why does it matter to you?" he said. "What I meant, by the soup." His voice was low and without its daytime edge. "You've got what you came for. You proved I'm not as indifferent as I'd like everyone to think." "Congratulations, it's true. So why are you still turning it over? You've had your verdict. Why do you keep prodding the wound?" The directness of it caught her off guard. She had braced for more wall, more deflection, and instead, he had walked straight up to the thing and laid his hand on it himself, which was so unlike the man she thought she knew that she had no defense prepared. "I don't know," she said, and the honesty of that surprised her too. The hour had got into her as well. "I think because it doesn't fit." "What doesn't?" "You." She turned her teacup slowly on its saucer, watching the candle flames swim in the cold dregs of it, because it was easier than watching him. "I've had you filed away for years, Malfoy. Settled. Known. The cruel boy who grew into a cold man, who atones in checks and silence, and never quite enough, who keeps everyone at arm's length, because that's safer than being looked at too closely. That's the file. It's a comfortable file. It tells me exactly how to feel about every room you walk into." She made herself look up. "And then you leave me soup. Soup that can't be made without a true heart. And the file doesn't fit anymore. And I'd rather..." She stopped, found the truth, said it. "I'd rather know the truth than keep a comfortable file. Even if the truth is more difficult. It's always been the worst thing about me, apparently. I can't leave a wrong answer alone." Something happened in his face. The exhaustion stayed, but through it came something else, a kind of careful astonishment, as though she had handed him an object he'd assumed was too valuable to ever be handed to him, and he wasn't sure his hands were clean enough to hold it. "That's not the worst thing about you," he said. She waited. The candle guttered and steadied. Outside the false window, a charm star fell in a slow silver arc and went out. "The worst thing about you," he went on, and there was the ghost of something in his voice that on any other night she'd have called dry humour, and tonight could only call tenderness wearing humour's coat, "is that you decide what something is, and then you defend the position past all reason. You did it for years. I was a thing you decided about. It was..." He turned the ink-smudged hand over, looked at the stain on it. "Restful, actually, being decided about. You knew where I stood, and I knew where you stood, and neither of us had to do the appalling work of finding out we might be wrong." He looked up. "I rather relied on it. You hating me. It was the most stable relationship I had." "I never hated you," she said, and discovered as she said it that it was true, and that it had been true for longer than she had let herself know. "I wanted to. It would have been simpler. I never quite managed it." The words landed in the quiet between them and changed the pressure of the air. She felt it on her skin, the way one feels the drop before a storm, that sudden charged density, that lifting of the fine hairs along the forearm. He went very still across the candle. The ink-smudged hand, which had been turning idly, stopped. "Don't," he said. But it was not the don't from the afternoon, the one armoured in fear. This one was barely a breath, almost a plea. The don't of a man standing at the edge of something he has wanted so long that wanting it has become indistinguishable from dreading it. "Don't say things like that to me at 1 in the morning. It isn't fair. I haven't got the daytime version of myself to hide behind. You're talking to whatever's left after 16 hours, and it's a great deal less defended than the one you usually fight with." "I know," she said. "I think that's why I'm saying it now." They were both leaning toward the candle without having decided to. The table was wide, but the file had crept over the hours into a single shared territory in its center, their papers overlapping, and they had both bent over that shared center to work, and now the bending had brought them close. Close enough that she could see the ink smudge on his hand in detail, close enough that the candle lit both their faces at once, close enough that when he exhaled, she felt it stir the loose hair at her temple. Neither of them moved back. The whole vast ministry held its breath around them, dark and emptied and indifferent, and the candle burned, and the charm stars glowed in the false indigo window, and the distance between them had become a live thing, taut, humming, the air gone thick as the moment before a hex lands. His eyes went to her mouth and came back up. She saw it happen. She felt her own breath go shallow. Her hand had come to rest on the shared center of the table, on the overlap of their papers, and his was there too, and the space between their two hands was perhaps the width of a quill, and the pull across that width was a physical thing now, a tension in the muscles of her arm, urging it the last small distance, and she watched his fingers shift, just barely, just enough toward hers. The candle lamp on the table flared without warning into sudden brightness, doubled as the night charm that maintained the ministry's lighting reached its appointed hour and brought the whole room up to full working glare in an instant. 1 o'clock relighting. The building does it every night. You'd know that if you ever left before 1, some distant clerical part of her mind supplied. and they sprang apart in the flood of cold, bright light, like two people caught at the scene of something, both of them suddenly fascinated by the papers in front of them, his hand withdrawn to his side of the table, hers pressed flat and trembling against the cursed wormwood deed. And the silence that came down between them was so total and so freighted and so impossible to climb back out of that for a long moment neither of them dared to so much as breathe. The wormwood hearing went their way. It happened in the cold, sharp light of the morning after, when both of them had slept perhaps 4 hours and carried it in the bruised skin beneath their eyes. And yet something had changed in the machinery of how they worked together. Some gear that had been grinding for 3 weeks now turning clean. They sat side by side before the review board, and they argued the cursed deed as a single instrument. His knowledge of the families threading through her command of the precedent so seamlessly that the board members glanced at one another, and when the third party's forged claim came apart under the joint weight of their case, it came apart completely, and the manor in Wiltshire went back to the line that had lost it, and it was, by any measure, a clean and total win. They should have been triumphant. Instead, they sat through the board's congratulations in a stiff and careful quiet, not quite looking at each other, both of them so vividly aware of the previous night, of a candle, of 2 hands the width of a quill apart, of the cold flood of light that had spared them and robbed them in the same instant, that the victory felt like something happening to other people. In the corridor afterward, with the grey-ribboned file finally closed and discharged, they stood for a moment in the awkward suspension of 2 people who have run out of the work that gave them an excuse to be near one another. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. And then there was nothing. No file to pass, no clause to dispute, no shared territory in the centre of a table. And the absence of it was so sudden and so total that they both stood there empty-handed in the torchlight, and he gave her a short nod that meant nothing and everything, and turned and walked away down the corridor, and his footsteps made a hollow, doubled echo on the stone that she stood and listened to until it faded. She told herself she was relieved. The thing was finished. The file was closed, and the unbearable near thing of the candlelight could be filed away with it, decided about, made safe. She had her answer about the soup, and she did not need to do anything with it. She could let it be the soup. She could let it be the project. She could take the win, as he'd said, the way she usually did. She lasted 9 days. It was not, she would later be unable to deny, the noble part of her that broke first. It was the part that could not leave a wrong answer alone, except that the answer had quietly stopped being his and become hers, and she had not noticed the substitution until it was complete. She found herself thinking about the soup at strange hours. She found herself thinking about what it had cost him to make it. Not the ingredients, which Verity said were nothing, but the other thing, the sincerity, the true heart he could not have faked. The fact that somewhere in some kitchen, Draco Malfoy had stood over a pot and wished her well so plainly and so completely that old hearth magic had bloomed up out of it. He had done that for her, and told no one, and wanted nothing back, and then stood in a candlelit room and begged her not to say kind things to him because he hadn't the strength to defend against them. He had given her something. The realization arrived slowly, and then all at once, the way the soup's smell had unfolded. He had given her something true and unguarded, at real cost to himself, and she had taken it. And she had given him nothing in return but interrogation and a near thing in the dark that the lights had ended before either of them had to be brave about it. The arithmetic of it sat wrong with her. She did not like to be in debt, and this was a debt, and there was only one currency in which it could honestly be paid. She would make him the soup. The decision, once made, took on the unstoppable momentum of all her decisions. She would learn the working, and she would make it, and she would leave it for him the way he had left it for her, and it would say what she could not yet make her own mouth say, what she had not even fully said to herself. Thank you, and I see you, and the file was wrong, and I am not indifferent. The soup would say it. The soup said things that the careful daytime self could not. That was the whole point of the soup. It did not occur to her, and this was the great blind spot of her clever, cataloguing mind, the one variable she failed to carry through the equation, that the magic worked in both directions. That the soup could not be made as a repayment of debt any more than it could be made as a favor to the project. That if it came out right, it would not be because she had followed the steps correctly. That a perfect bowl would be evidence of exactly one thing, the only thing it was ever evidence of, and that she would be making that evidence with her own 2 hands, and handing it to the one person in England who knew precisely how to read it. She did not think of any of this. She thought only that she owed him and that she would pay. The recipe was the difficulty. It was not written down. Verity had been clear on that. It could not be written down. And so Hermione did the only thing she knew how to do, which was research. And the research led her down strange and unfamiliar corridors. There were no books. Magical gastronomy had nothing. The old domestic magic texts, the ones about hearth-workings and house charms, and the quiet, undocumented magic of the great kitchens, spoke of such things only obliquely in the maddening half-language of traditions passed mother to daughter and never meant for strangers. She gathered what she could. The ingredients were ordinary, that much every source agreed. Root vegetables, an onion cooked past patience into gold, thyme, a marrow bone for the broth, and a final herb that the texts named only as the kind one, which he eventually, after a frustrating week of dead ends, identified as a common variety of rest harrow that grew in hedgerows and was prized by old hearth witches for no property listed in any apothecary's catalogue. But the ingredients were not the working. The working was the part the books could not give her. And so, on the 9th night, in her own small kitchen, with the rain coming down outside the window in a steady silver hiss against the glass, and the city beyond gone soft and blurred, Hermione Granger set a pot on the hob and tried to make a magic she did not understand the mechanism of and could not look up. She chopped the onion. She set it to cook low and slow the way the one source had insisted, past patience, until it forgets it was ever sharp. She let it go gold, and then deeper than gold while the kitchen filled with the smell of it. She added the bone, and the water, and the roots, and the thyme, and the kind herb, and she stood over the pot in the rain light, and stirred. And she had no idea whether she was doing it right, because there was no right. There was only, what? Sincerity, intention, a true heart toward the one who would eat it. So she thought about him. She had not meant it as a method. She had meant only to do the thing properly, to give it her full attention as she gave everything her full attention, and her full attention, set loose over a steaming pot in a rain-blurred kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, went where it had been secretly going for 9 days, which was to Draco Malfoy. She thought of the ink smudge on the side of his hand. She thought of the way candlelight had worn the hardness off his face and left something young and tired in its place. She thought of his voice saying, "I never hated you," given back to her. Of his, "Don't, it isn't fair." Of the white knuckles uncurling slowly against the table as she reached past his wall and put her hand on what it guarded. She thought of a spoon laid parallel to a rim by a man who could not say a kind thing out loud, and so cooked it instead. And she thought, without deciding to, without permitting it, the thought simply arriving fully formed out of the steam, "I would like to be the reason that hardness leaves his face. I would like to be the warm thing in whatever cold place he keeps. I want him to taste this and know he is not alone in it." She stirred. The rain hissed. The steam rose and curled and filled the small bright kitchen, and the smell of the soup unfolded around her exactly as it had unfolded over the cafeteria table. Warmth and gold and time and that nameless resin-bright note beneath, the kind one, the one that pulled at something behind the sternum and made a person think of firelight and a steadying hand. And she did not notice it happening, because she was inside the smell now. She was its source, and one does not smell one's own kitchen the way a stranger does. She tasted it. The spoon was halfway to her mouth before the implication of what she was tasting reached her. The first note was warmth, the going down warmth that kept going, into the shoulders, down the arms to the fingertips, and she stood with the spoon at her lips and the rain at the window and felt the floor of her certainty drop out from under her for the second time in a fortnight, because the soup was perfect. It was perfect on the first attempt. It was every bit as good as the bowl he had left her, the same impossible warmth, the same opening, the same window thrown wide to let a little light into the cold. And there was only one thing in the entire architecture of the magic that a perfect bowl could possibly mean, and she had just made one, and the meaning of it stood up in her own small kitchen and looked her full in the face and would not let her look away. The spoon clattered into the pot. She stepped back from the hob as though it had burned her. Her hand had gone to the cuff of her sleeve and was straightening it, smoothing it, tugging it down over her wrist, over and over, a frantic small busyness with nothing to busy itself about. And her heart was going hard and fast, and her face had gone hot in the rain-cool kitchen, because the soup did not lie. The soup could not lie. That was the entire and terrible point of it. And she had made it perfectly on the first try, which meant her heart had been true, which meant her intention had been sincere, which meant the thing she had not said to herself, the thing she had buried under the comfortable word debt, was so completely and uncomplicatedly real that it had bloomed up out of her into old magic without her permission and against her will. She stood in her kitchen with the rain coming down and the perfect, treacherous soup steaming on the hob. and she understood that she had set out to repay a confession and had instead made one of her own, a fuller and more naked confession than his had ever been, because his, at least, had been deliberate, a thing he chose to give, while hers had been wrung out of her by her own hands before she had managed to admit a word of it even in the privacy of her own skull, and that the proof of it was now sitting in a pot, and that there was only one person on earth she could give it to, and that the moment she did, he would taste it, and he would know how to read it, and the role they had played in that working room, he confessing, she demanding answers, would turn entirely and irrevocably over, and it would be her secret laid bare in his hands, and she would have no wall at all left to stand behind. She turned off the hob. She did not pour the soup away. She stood and looked at it for a very long time while the rain ran down the glass, and somewhere beneath the panic, a different feeling was rising, slow and warm and steadying, the soup's own feeling, the window thrown open, and she realized, with a calm that frightened her more than the panic had, that she was not going to pour it away at all. She carried it to work the next morning in a stoppered flask charmed to hold its heat, and the flask sat in her bag all through the lift's descent and all through the long morning at her desk, like something alive, like something with a pulse, like a letter she had written in a moment of weakness and could not now decide whether to send. She had not slept. Again. She was beginning to think she would never sleep properly again, as long as Draco Malfoy occupied the particular corner of her mind he had moved into without paying rent. She had lain awake watching the rain light move on the ceiling and arguing both sides of it with the relentless thoroughness she brought to everything, and the arguments had gone in circles all night. Don't give it to him. Pour it away and pretend the experiment failed. He need never know. And then, from the other side, you owe him the truth. He gave you his and stood there defenseless while you took it apart. The least you owe him is the same courage. And under both arguments, steady as the rain, the soup's own quiet feeling, the one it had bloomed up out of her, refusing to be argued with at all. You want him to know. That is the whole reason you made it. Stop pretending it was about a debt. By midday, she had not decided, which for Hermione Granger was its own kind of agony, and the flask sat warm and patient in her bag, and she could not work, and at last she gathered it up and went to find him, the way she had gone to find him a fortnight before, except that this time she carried the evidence with her own two hands, and there was no hiding behind a demand for answers, because she was the one with something to confess. The working room on the 4th level was empty. The wormwood file was gone, discharged, and the long table had been cleared, and the grey ribbons taken away, and without the work, the room was just a narrow records overflow again, smelling of old leather and dust, the false window showing a grey afternoon, and a fine rain falling on nothing. She stood in the doorway with the flask in her hand, and felt the absence of him like a held breath let out, half relief and half a disappointment so sharp it told her more than she wanted to know. She found him, in the end, in the small ministry tea room at the end of the 4th level corridor, a cramped place with a single window and a kettle that never quite boiled, deserted at this hour where he had gone. She understood at once, seeing him, to be alone. He stood at the window with his back to the door and a cup of something untouched going cold in his hand. And he was looking out at the rain on the charm glass with the particular stillness of a man who believes himself unobserved, and the daytime self had slipped, the way it slips when no one is watching, and what stood at the window was simply tired and quiet and somewhere far away. He heard her and turned, and the careful blankness came down over his face so fast she actually saw it arrive, like a curtain dropped, and she thought, I am getting good at watching the moment before the curtain falls, and the thing behind the curtain is never what the files said it would be. Granger. His voice was even. The files closed. Whatever it is, it can wait till. I made you soup, she said. The words came out of her before she could arrange them better, blunt and bare, and she watched them land. He went very still. His eyes went from her face to the flask in her hand and stayed there, and she watched the meaning of it assemble behind his eyes, the way she had felt it assemble behind her own in the kitchen. The recognition, the implication, the swift and devastating arithmetic of a man who knew exactly what the soup was and exactly what a person had to feel to make it work. What kind of soup? He said, very carefully, and it was not really a question. It was a man asking her to confirm or deny the thing he could already smell, because she had unstoppered the flask without meaning to. Her hands had done it while her mind was elsewhere, and the warmth and the gold and the thyme and the kind herb were unfolding into the cramped tea room, filling it, and there was no possibility on earth that he did not recognize his own mother's working. You know what kind, she said. His hand, the one holding the cold cup, set it down on the windowsill with a click of china that was very loud in the quiet. The other had gone white-knuckled at his side. He did not move toward her. He stood at the window with the grey rain-light behind him, turning his pale hair to silver and his face to something carved, and he looked at the opened flask and the steam rising from it, and she watched the wall he lived behind take the impact of it, take blow after blow, because he understood, she could see him understanding, that this was not a repayment, could not be a repayment, that the magic did not permit repayments, that a perfect soup meant one thing, and one thing only, and that she had made one and brought it to him and was standing in the doorway holding the proof of her own true heart in a charmed flask. It came out right, he said. It was barely above a whisper. Didn't it? First time. It came out right. Yes. You know what that means. He said it almost desperately, as though he were giving her one last chance to take it back, to claim she'd followed a recipe, to let it be anything other than what it was. Granger, you? Of all people, you know what that means. It can't be a thank you. It can't be settling a score. It doesn't work for that. You told me so yourself. You stood in that room and threw my own mother's magic in my face and told me it can't be faked. His voice cracked down the middle. So, don't stand there and tell me it's a thank you. Tell me what it actually is, or pour it down the sink, and we'll never speak of it. But don't make me read it for you, and then pretend I read it wrong. And there it was, the inversion, complete, total, the whole turning over of everything. A fortnight ago, she had stood across a table and refused to let him hide behind the project, had demanded he say the thing the soup proved, had reached past his wall and put her hand on what it guarded while he begged her not to make him say it. And now it was hers. Now the proof was in her hands, and the wall was hers to either stand behind or step out from. And he was the one demanding honesty. He was the one who would not let her hide. And he had thrown her own words back at her with a precision that left her nowhere to go. She set the flask down on the small table by the door. Her hands were not quite steady. She looked at it, the steam rising, the impossible, perfect soup that her own heart had made. And then she looked at him, at the white knuckles and the cracked voice, and the desperate hope he was trying so hard to keep from his face, and failing. And she understood that she had two choices, and only two. She could lie and pour it away and keep the comfortable file forever. Or she could do the thing she had spent her whole life doing, which was refuse to leave a true answer unspoken. "It's not a thank you," she said. Her voice came out low and shook on the last word, and she let it shake. "You're right. It can't be. I told myself I owed you, that you'd given me something, and I had to pay it back, that it was about the debt." She made herself hold his eyes. "But the magic doesn't work for debts any more than it works for projects. I made it perfectly on the first try, in my own kitchen, in the rain, thinking about..." Her breath went short. "Thinking about you, about the ink on your hand, about what your face looks like when you stop performing, about wanting to be the reason the hardness leaves it. I didn't know I was thinking any of that until it was already in the pot. The soup knew before I did. A breath. I came here to repay a confession. I made one instead. A worse one. A truer one. Because at least yours was on purpose, and mine was wrung out of me before I'd admitted a word of it even to myself. So that's what it is, Malfoy. That's what's in the flask. It's me, finding out the file was wrong, with my own two hands, and bringing it to the one person who'd know how to read it." Her chin came up, though her eyes had gone bright and stinging. "There. You wanted me to say it instead of making you read it. I said it. It said..." The silence after was enormous. The rain ticked on the charm glass. The kettle that never quite boiled ticked toward a boil it would not reach. The soup steamed between them on the little table, its warmth unfolding through the cramped room. And Draco Malfoy stood at the window with the grey light behind him and looked at her with his whole face open at last. The curtain not just slipped, but gone, swept entirely away. And what was behind it was not cold, and was not carved, and was not anything the file had ever contained. It was a man who had spent years learning to expect nothing, and had just been handed the one thing he had not let himself want, and did not know what to do with his hands, and did not know how to make his face hold still, and did not, for once in his careful life, even try. He crossed the room. He did it without a word, 3 quick strides across the small space, and she had a half-second to register the change in him, the deciding, the wall coming down not by erosion this time, but by his own hand demolished. And then he was in front of her, close, closer than the candlelit table had ever let him come. Near enough that she could see the grey of his eyes had gone dark, and the smudge of sleeplessness beneath them, and the way his breath had gone as short as hers. And his hand came up, not quite touching, hovering at the line of her jaw, the warmth of it close enough to feel against her skin. And he searched her face for the lie, for the catch, for the thing that would let him keep his armor on a moment longer. And he did not find it, because there was nothing there to find, and she did not step back. She tilted her face the smallest fraction toward the warmth of his unmoving hand. And the air between them went so taut and so charged that the rain and the kettle and the whole grey afternoon seemed to fall silent and wait. His thumb came to rest at last against the line of her cheekbone, the lightest pressure, a question more than a touch, and she felt the warmth of his palm settle along her jaw, and his head bent toward hers by a degree, and another, slow, unbearably slow, giving her every chance in the world to pull away. And she did not pull away. She closed the last of the distance herself, rising the smallest fraction onto the balls of her feet, her own hand finding the front of his robes and closing in the fabric there. And the tea-room door banged open behind her on its stiff hinge, and a junior clerk with an armful of files stopped dead on the threshold, and Draco's hand dropped from her face, and they stepped apart into the flood of fluorescent corridor light, and the clerk stammered something about the kettle and fled, and the moment hung in the wreckage, broken open and unfinished, and absolutely impossible to take back. The clerk's footsteps fled away down the corridor and left behind a silence so complete that the not quite boiling kettle's tick sounded like a clock counting down. They stood 3 feet apart in the cramped tea-room, with the fluorescent corridor light still spilling cold through the open door, and the warmth of his hand was still a ghost along her jaw, and the soup still steamed on the little table, and neither of them said anything at all, because the thing that had nearly happened was so enormous and so nearly happened that any word would have been the wrong size for it. Draco moved first. He went to the door and shut it, quietly this time, the latch easing home under his hand rather than banging. And the corridor light was cut off, and the room dropped back into the soft grey of the rain charm in the window, and the change was like the difference between standing in a crowd and standing in a chapel. He did not turn around right away. He stood with his hands still flat against the closed door, his back to her, his shoulders set, and she watched the breath go in and out of him, and understood that he was assembling himself, or trying to, and that the trying was costing him. "I should not have done that," he said to the door. The words went through her like cold water. "Done what? You didn't do anything. I was going to." He turned then, and his face had not gone back behind the curtain. That was the thing that undid her, that he let her see it, the wall demolished and not rebuilt. But it had something new in it, something that looked like fear wearing the clothes of resolve. "I was going to, and I'm glad the wretched boy walked in, because it stopped me doing a thing I'd have regretted." He saw her flinch, and his hand came up, quick. Not regret you, Merlin. Not that. Regret doing it like that, in a tea room, before I'd said any of the things a person ought to say first. Before I'd told you what you'd actually be." He stopped, and his jaw worked, and the white came up in his knuckles where his hand had closed at his side. "You made me soup, Granger. You stood there and said it out loud, the whole of it, no armor, and it was the bravest thing I've ever watched anyone do, and I was about to answer it by kissing you against a notice board without telling you a single true thing in return. You deserve better arithmetic than that." She came a step closer. The soup steamed between them. "Then tell me the true things." He laughed, once, short, with no humour in it, the laugh of a man at the edge of a high place. "You don't know what you're asking for." "I do. I've spent a fortnight finding out the file on you was wrong. I'd like to read the real one. Tell me." She softened it, because she could see what it was costing him, and because she had learned this fortnight that the way past his wall was never force. "Tell me the thing you stood in your kitchen and wished when you made the soup. You made me say mine. It's only fair." The fairness of it reached him. She saw it land. He turned away again, but not to the door this time. To the window, to the grey rain on the charm glass. And he spoke to the rain rather than to her, which she understood was the only way he could get the words out at all. The way she had spoken to her teacup in the candlelight, rather than to his face. "My mother made that soup for people she wished well," he said. "You know that. Verity told you. Friends and enemies alike. She'd send it round before my father's worst business, and she meant it. Every bowl she genuinely wished those men no harm, even as my father planned them every harm in the world. I used to think it was weakness. I thought softness was a thing that got you killed. I had a great deal of evidence for that growing up. I watched what happened to people who were soft in the houses I grew up in." His hand flattened against the cold glass. "After the war, I decided the safest thing a man could be was useful and silent. Pay what you owe. Fix what you broke. Never want anything out loud, because everything I'd ever wanted out loud had been used to make me into something I'm ashamed of. So I paid, and I fixed, and I kept quiet, and I told myself that was atonement, and it was also just hiding. You said it yourself. Checks and silence, and never quite enough. I shouldn't have said that. You were right to. It was true." He turned his head, just enough to find her in the edge of his vision. "And then I got put on a project with you, and I watched you for 3 weeks being the most alive person in any room you walked into, furious and brilliant and incapable of leaving a wrong thing alone. And I started, against every rule I'd made for myself, to want something out loud. I wanted you to stop hating me, not for the project, not because it was useful, because I'd started to." The word caught in his throat, and he had to force it past. "To care what you thought of me, more than I've cared about anything in years. And I knew I'd never say it, because saying things is how you get them taken away. So I did the only thing I knew how to do, the thing my mother taught me, the thing that says the words for you when you haven't got the courage to say them yourself." He looked at her fully now. "I made you the soup, and I stood in that kitchen, and I wished, not that you'd be sharp for the review board. I wished you'd be happy. I wished the cold place in you, wherever you keep it, the one I recognized because I've got the same one. I wished it would get a little warmer for an afternoon. That's what I made. That's what was in the bowl. It wasn't strategy. It was the only confession I had the nerve to make. And I made it where you couldn't see my face." The rain ticked on the glass. The kettle ticked toward its impossible boil. Hermione stood with her hands very still at her sides for once. No cuff to straighten, nothing to busy them with, because the thing he was saying had stopped her hands the way a great cold or a great heat stops them, and she found her eyes had filled. And now "You've gone and done the same thing back," he said, and his voice had dropped, gone rough and low and wondering. "You stood in your kitchen in the rain and wished me warm, and the magic believed you, the way it believed me. And now we're both standing here, holding the proof of the other one, and neither of us has anywhere left to hide. So that's the true thing, Granger. That's the real file. I've wanted you out loud for weeks, and been too much of a coward to say it in any language but soup. There. Now you've got it from me with my face showing, which is more than I gave you the first time. And I'd rather have the door bang open and stop me being a coward in a tea room than do this any way but properly." She crossed the small space the way he had crossed it before, and she did not stop 3 feet away. She came right up to him, into the warmth of him, near enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes, and she put her hand flat against his chest, not gripping the robes this time, just resting there, palm open, over the place where she could feel his heart going hard and quick and frightened beneath the fine wool. "Then do this properly," she said. "Granger. Stop calling me Granger when you're saying things like that. You sound like we're in a meeting." A breath went out of him that was almost a laugh, almost a sob, the breath of a man whose last defense has been gently dismantled. "Hermione," he said, and it came out unpracticed, careful, as though he were handling something he was afraid to drop. "I don't know how to do this properly. I've never once done it properly. I've spent my whole life learning the opposite." "Neither have I." Her thumb moved, the smallest stroke against the wool over his heart. "I built a whole self out of being right about things, and I was wrong about you, completely. And it's the best wrong I've ever been. So we'll be terrible at it together. That's allowed. That's how everyone does it, I think. Badly, and together, and finding out as they go." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "I'm not asking you to be good at it. I'm asking you to not be a coward for one more minute. You said you'd rather do this properly. Fine. This is properly. 2 people who can't say what they feel except in soup, saying it anyway, with their faces showing, in a tea room with a kettle that doesn't boil. There won't be a better moment. There's never a better moment. There's only whether you do it or you don't." His hand came up again, both hands this time, and one settled along her jaw the way it had before, the warmth of it spreading down her throat, and the other came to rest at the small of her back, light, a question, drawing her the last half-inch closer, and she felt the whole length of the distance between them go taut and singing, and finally collapsed to nothing, his forehead coming down to rest against hers, their breath mingling in the scant warm space, his eyes falling shut, hers falling shut, the rain on the glass and the soup steaming on the table and the kettle ticking, and the whole grey indifferent ministry holding its breath around the 2 of them. And he tilted his head, and she felt his mouth a hair's breadth from hers, the warmth of it, the almost of it, and he breathed her borrowed name once more, like a man stepping off a high place at last, Hermione. And then his lips found hers, and the kettle, after weeks of trying, finally and absurdly began to shriek. Neither of them moved to silence the kettle. It shrieked its thin, triumphant note into the grey afternoon, the small machine that had failed for weeks to do the one thing it existed for, suddenly succeeding at the most inconvenient possible moment. And they let it shriek, because to break apart now to deal with it would have been to break apart, and that was unthinkable. So the kettle screamed, and the rain hissed on the charm glass, and the soup steamed forgotten on the little table. And Draco Malfoy kissed her, as though he had been holding his breath for years, and had only just remembered how to let it out. It was not, at first, the kiss either of them might have imagined if they had let themselves imagine it. It was careful, terribly, achingly careful, a man handling a thing he could not believe he was allowed to hold, his mouth gentle against hers, asking rather than taking, and she understood the carefulness for what it was, understood that he was braced even now for it to be snatched away, that some part of him was still waiting for the floor to open. So she answered the carefulness with certainty. Her hand slid from his chest up to the side of his neck, her fingers finding the warm skin above his collar, and she pressed into him, into the kiss, telling him without a word that the floor was not going to open, that she was not going to be snatched away, that she had made the soup and meant the soup, and was here, was staying, was his to hold. And she felt the moment he believed it. She felt it go through him, the breath that left him in a rush, the tension she had not even fully registered, draining out of his shoulders all at once, the hand at the small of her back closing, drawing her fully against him, no longer a question. The careful kiss became something else, something with the weeks of withheld wanting in it, his fingers sliding up into her hair, and she made a small sound against his mouth that she would have been mortified by at any other time, and was not mortified by now. And the kettle shrieked on, and the rain came down, and for a long, bright suspended, while the whole rest of the world simply ceased to be relevant. When they finally broke apart, it was only by an inch, only enough to breathe, foreheads still together, both of them unsteady. His eyes opened and found hers from very close, dark and dazed and disbelieving, and the careful daytime self was nowhere in them at all. The kettle, she managed, let it scream. It's been trying to boil for a fortnight. We should let it have its moment. A laugh broke out of him, real this time, helpless, and she felt it move through his chest where she was pressed against him, and the sound of it. Draco Malfoy laughing, actually laughing, undefended, with his forehead against hers and his hands in her hair, was a thing she decided in that instant she intended to spend a great deal of effort causing to happen again. He reached out without looking, found the kettle, took it off its ring, and the shriek died into a sulky hiss, and then to nothing, and the silence that flooded in behind it was warm and enormous, and entirely different from every silence that had come before, because every silence before had been the silence of things unsaid, and this one was the silence of things finally, blessedly, said. "I've made a mess of your soup," he said, looking at the steaming flask on the table. "It's gone half cold while I was busy being a coward, and then busy being—" He stopped. "Being what?" "Brave," he admitted, as though confessing to a crime. "I don't have a lot of practice. I may need supervision. I'll supervise." She drew back enough to look at him properly, to take in the whole improbable fact of him. Flushed, dishevelled, the pale hair she had put her hands through standing up where her fingers had been, the wall not merely down, but seemingly forgotten, a man she had hated, a man she had filed away, A man she had been so completely and comprehensively wrong about that the wrongness had turned into the truest thing in her life. Eat the soup. It's yours. You made it. I made it for you. That was the entire point. Eat it, Draco. His name in her mouth still felt new, still felt like a thing she was learning the shape of. And she watched it land on him the way Hermione had landed on her. Watched the small visible pleasure of it that he tried and failed to keep off his face. I want to watch you taste the thing I couldn't say. So he did. He picked up the flask and he drank from it, there at the window with the rain behind him, and she watched the warmth go into him the way it had gone into her in the cafeteria. Watched it reach his face and his shoulders, and somewhere deeper that she could not see but could guess at, the cold place he'd spoken of, the one he said he recognized in her because he had the same one. She watched it get a little warmer. His eyes closed. When he opened them, they were bright in a way she chose, kindly, not to remark upon, and he set the flask down very gently, and he said, in a voice gone rough, "It's better than my mother's." "It is not." "It is." "Don't argue with me. You'll only be wrong. You're very bad at being wrong." He caught her hand before she could swat him, and the teasing fell away, and he held her hand in both of his and looked down at it as though it was something rare. "It's better because—" He searched for it. This man who could only ever find words for the things that mattered most when there was no other choice. Because hers was kindness in general. She wished everyone well, friends and enemies. She cast it wide. This was narrow. This was aimed. You made a soup that only works on sincerity, and you aimed the whole of it at one person, and the person was me. His thumb moved over her knuckles. Nobody's aimed anything at me in a very long time. Not anything good. I'd forgotten what it was like to be the one a thing was for. The afternoon went on around them, grey and rain-soft and utterly transformed. They did not, in the end, manage to be anywhere near as graceful about the rest of it as the moment perhaps deserved. They were both out of practice and frightened in the way that follows getting the thing you wanted, and there was a stretch of clumsy half-sentences and a near quarrel about who was going to tell verity, and a debate, conducted with their hands still tangled together, about whether what had just happened was advisable, given that they would have to keep working together, which Hermione won by pointing out that they had just successfully argued the wormwood claim as a single instrument, and were therefore obviously professionally compatible, and which Draco conceded by kissing her again, which she chose to interpret as agreement. But beneath the clumsiness and the fear and the unaccustomed laughter, something had settled into place with the quiet finality of a thing that was always going to happen and had simply taken its time. The file was closed, not the wormwood file, which had been closed for over a week, but the other one, the one she had kept on him for years, settled, dangerous, known, closed and burned, and replaced with something she did not yet have words for, and was, for once in her cataloguing life, content to leave unlabelled. He was not the man in the file. He had never been the man in the file. He was a man who said kind things in soup because the world had taught him that kind things said out loud got taken away, and she was going to spend a long time, she suspected, teaching him otherwise. And the teaching would be slow, because everything about him was slow. The wall came down by inches and would no doubt try to rebuild itself in the night and have to be talked down again in the morning, and she found she did not mind. She had never minded a long project. She was, by temperament and by trade, a person who did the patient work. "What happens now?" he asked her, when the rain had thinned to almost nothing on the charm glass, and the grey afternoon was edging toward the dim gold of evening. They were sitting now, side by side on the little tea-room bench, her head not quite on his shoulder, his hand not quite around hers, both of them in the cautious half-measures of people not yet used to being allowed. "Practically. Tomorrow. We can't very well announce it in the lift." "We don't have to announce anything." She turned her hand the small distance to lace her fingers through his, completing the half-measure, making it whole. "We make the soup for each other when one of us forgets. We argue about precedent and win our cases. We have dinner somewhere that isn't this building where the kettle works, and we find out, slowly, badly, together, whether two people who only ever learn to hide can learn to do the opposite. That's what happens now. That's a very long project. I like long projects. I'm extremely good at them." She felt him laugh again, that low, helpless laugh she had decided to collect, and she pressed her shoulder into his. And outside the false window the rain stopped altogether, and the charm glass showed, for the first time all day, a thin, clear band of evening gold breaking beneath the grey. And the cold place in her, the one she had not known she kept until he named his own, was warm. Soup warm. Hearth warm. Warm in the old undocumented way that no apothecary could bottle and no book could hold. And she sat in the gold and grey light with her hand in his, and understood that she was, against every expectation and every file she had ever kept, simply and completely happy. Autumn came down over London the way it always did, slow and then all at once. The plane trees along the embankment going gold and then bare, the evenings drawing in early and blue, and the rain settling into the long companionable drizzle that the city wore like a familiar coat. 6 months had passed since the tea-room and the kettle, and the world had not ended, which had been, in those first cautious weeks, Draco's chief and most stubborn fear. That something so good must necessarily be the prelude to its own destruction, that the floor was still waiting to open. It had not opened. The floor, it turned out, was simply the floor. They had told Verity first, which had not been a decision so much as an inevitability, because Verity Abbott missed nothing, and had been watching them with open delight since the morning she'd recognized the soup. And when Hermione had finally come to her desk to say haltingly that there was something she ought to know, Verity had set down her teacup and said, "About time. I'd given you another week before I started leaving cookery books on your chair." And that had been the whole of it. The ministry, when it found out the way the ministry found out everything, by degrees and gossip, and the eventual undeniable evidence of 2 people leaving the building together, more evenings than coincidence allowed. And there had been a flurry of talk, and then the talk had moved on to fresher scandals, the way talk does, and they had been left, blessedly, alone. The slow project had been exactly as slow as she'd promised. The wall had tried to rebuild itself, just as she'd known it would. There had been mornings early on when he'd woken behind his own ramparts again, clipped and careful and braced, and she had learned not to take it as retreat, but as weather, a thing that passed if you waited it out and did not panic. She had learned the particular silence that meant he was ashamed of something old surfacing, and the different silence that meant he was simply tired, and the rarest silence of all, the one she had come to treasure, the easy one, the one with no held breath in it, the silence of a man at rest in a room with someone he trusted. He, for his part, had learned, slowly, badly, the only way he learned anything that mattered, to say the small true things out loud before they had to be cooked into a pot. "I missed you today. I'm frightened of this. I'm glad you're here." They came out of him stiffly, like coins long buried, but they came, and each one was a brick taken out of the wall and not put back. And there had been soup. There had been a great deal of soup. It had become their private language, the thing the early stiffness gave way to before the spoken words could manage it. A flask left on a desk on a bad morning, a pot on the hob when one of them came home wrung out and grey, the warmth and the gold and the time, and the kind herb unfolding through a kitchen that had become, somewhere in those 6 months, and without either of them quite deciding it, their kitchen, in a flat that was hers and was increasingly also his. His books migrating onto her shelves a few at a time, the way his words migrated out of him, slowly and then irreversibly. They made it for each other, and it always came out right every time, perfect every time. And they had long since stopped being surprised by that, because the magic only told the truth, and the truth between them had stopped being in any doubt. Which was why the letter, when it came, mattered so much. It arrived on a grey October morning by an owl Hermione did not recognize, a great tawny thing that came to the kitchen window while they were both still in their dressing gowns over coffee, and it bore a heavy cream envelope sealed with green wax, and a crest she knew at once from the wormwood file and 100 other places. The Malfoy crest pressed deep into the wax, and beneath it, in a hand she did not know but Draco clearly did, because she watched the colour leave his face when he saw it. The direction was written not to him, but to her. Miss Hermione Granger. He went very still. The white came up in his knuckles around his coffee cup. "That's my mother's hand." "Your mother is writing to me?" "My mother does not write to anyone. My mother has not written a letter in years. She and my father left all of it behind. The city, the ministry, the people, the whole performance of it. They live in Wiltshire, and they see no one, and they want nothing to do with any of it." He set the cup down. His voice had gone careful in the old way, the braced way, and she reached across the small table and put her hand over his white knuckles without a word, and felt them slowly loosen under her palm. "Open it." "I can't." "Open it and read it to me." So she broke the green wax and unfolded the heavy cream paper and read, while the rain ticked at the window and the coffee went cold. "Miss Granger, you will forgive an old woman's directness. I have given up the time for anything else. My son does not write to us often, and when he does, he tells us nothing of consequence, which is how I have always known the things of consequence were happening. He has mentioned your name 4 times in 6 months. He has never in his life mentioned anyone 4 times. I drew my conclusions. I understand you have learned to make my soup. I understand further that it works for you. You will know, then, what that means, because you are, by all accounts, the cleverest witch of your generation, and could hardly fail to work it out. I am not writing to give you my blessing, which you did not ask for and do not need. I am writing to tell you something that no book holds, and that my son will never tell you himself, because he does not know it. The soup did not work for me the first time I made it, nor the second, nor the 20th. I made it for years before it ever came out as anything but a pleasant, forgettable broth, because for years I made it out of duty and obligation, and the wish to be useful to a husband who frightened me. And the working knows the difference between duty and love as surely as it knows salt from sugar. It was a very long time before I made it and meant it. You made it perfectly on your first attempt. I do not know whether you understand what that tells me about the size of the thing you feel, but I understood it the moment I heard, and it is why I have broken a silence of years to write to a stranger. My son was raised by people who taught him that softness is fatal, and that wanting things aloud is how they are taken from you. I was one of those people. It is the great wound of my life, and there is no soup that mends it. But you have made him laugh. He wrote the word, laughed, as though reporting a miracle, and perhaps to him it was. Whatever the wall is that he keeps, you appear to have got behind it, which is more than his father or I ever managed, and I find that I am too old and too tired to be anything but grateful. And so this letter is my gratitude, badly expressed in the only currency our family has ever been able to spend. Come to Wiltshire in the spring, both of you. I will make the soup, and it will work, because I have finally, at the end of everything, learned how, and I should like to feed it to the two people for whom it most plainly works. Bring nothing. Bring only him, warm, which I gather is your particular gift. N.M. Hermione lowered the letter. The kitchen was very quiet, only the rain and the small tick of the cooling coffee, and when she looked up, Draco was not braced any more. The wall was not up. His face was open and undone and wet, and he was looking at her across the small table in their small flat, with his books on the shelves and the rain at the window, with an expression she had no file for and would never need one for, because she intended to spend the rest of her life learning it by heart. She's never said any of that, he managed. Not to me, not in 30 years, not once. She said it to you just now, Hermione said softly. She had to root it through me, but she said it. That's how your family talks, apparently. Sideways, through soup and through other people. You come by it honestly. She came around the table and folded herself into his lap, the letter still in her hand, and he wrapped his arms around her and put his face against her neck and held on, and she felt him shaking, just slightly, the way a wall shakes in the moment, before it finally, gratefully, comes the rest of the way down. We'll go in the spring, she said into his hair. We'll let her make us the soup, and it'll work, because she's learned how, and because we'll mean it sitting at her table just as much as we mean it here. And your mother will get to watch the thing she could never give you given back to her, full circle, in a bowl. She drew back to look at him, to put her hands on either side of his undone face. That's a good ending, Draco, for all three of you, even the ones who taught you the wall. There's a window in it now. The soup found it. I found it. You let me. I let you. he said, wondering as though it were the strangest and best thing he had ever done. I don't know why. I never let anyone. Because I made you soup and meant it, she said, and you finally let yourself be the one a thing was for. She kissed the corner of his mouth, the wet of it, the salt. And you're going to go on being the one things are for a very long time, because I'm an extremely persistent woman, and I've decided about you, and you know how I am once I've decided. I defend the position past all reason. A laugh came out of him through the tears, the helpless one, the one she collected, and he caught her closer, and outside the grey October window, the rain went on falling soft over the gold and bare and beautiful city, and on the hob, where she had set it going before the owl ever came, a pot of soup was beginning, slow and gold and certain, to fill their kitchen with the smell of every true thing neither of them had ever been able to say aloud and no longer needed to, because it was said now, and it would go on being said in the oldest and kindest language they had, for as long as the two of them cared to keep the fire lit, which she rather thought, with her arms around the warm and weeping and finally unwalled length of him, was going to be the whole of the rest of their lives.
Thank you for listening to this story. I wrote it because of one small idea. There is a soup that cannot lie. You can follow every step, you can buy every ingredient, but it only works if your heart is true. If you cook is for the wrong reason, it comes out flat. Just plain, boring soup. I like that idea because it is honest. People can hide behind good manners. Food cannot hide anything. While I was writing, I keep thinking about my favorite line. Draco says, I'd forgotten what it was like to be the one a thing was for. That is the whole story for me. Not love, just being the person someone made something for. Some people never say the wrong things out loud. They are afraid. So they say it in other ways. They cook, they fix your car, they leave a spoon next to your bowl. So here is the moral, I think. Look at what people do for you, not only at what they say, and say the kind thing out loud anyway. Do not wait for the soup. Thank you.